In fact, if you wanted to categorize greenhouse gases, to paraphrase a colleague of mine, he says that greenhouse gas number 1, 2, 3, and 4 is water vapor, with carbon dioxide would be a distant 5. CO2 has an influence, but it's certainly not significant enough for us to worry about.
More likely, the warming is part of a natural cycle that has been ongoing for millennia.
The paleoclimatic data that I and others have collected, it's obvious that climate is and always has been variable. In fact, the only constant about climate is change. It changes continually.
Past climate researchers have found that over much of the world between about 1400 and in some places as late as 1900, there was a period of colder than average temperature over the world called the Little Ice Age. And before that, there was a period of unusual warmth called the Medieval Optimal, or Warm Period. So warming and cooling are part of the norm. The 20th century is not out of balance compared to the past.
So that created a very familiar curve that appeared in the early IPCC reports. And then suddenly, in 1998, a study came out, which is now referred to as the MBH 98, because the three authors' names, the first one is the one that's spoken about the most, which is Mann, published a report in which they completely rejected that widely accepted temperature graph.
The MBH98 graph became known as the hockey stick curve, where the shaft of the stick was the relatively constant lower temperatures for the first 900 years of the past millennium, and the blade of the stick the reputed sudden temperature rise of the past century. Although Mann's research was never audited, the United Nations and environmentalists promoted it as the smoking gun that recent warming was unusual. Analyst Stephen McIntyre, in cooperation with Ross McKittrick of the University of Guelph, decided to take a closer look at the data.
We carried out an analysis of the results to see what happened when we recompiled the data, and got quite different answers. Instead of having an extraordinarily high 20th century, we had a 15th century value that was just as high as the 20th century. So the hockey stick disappeared. It's a computer programming error that yields these hockey sticks. This piece of the jigsaw puzzle needs to be removed before science can develop a proper understanding of the climate history of the last millennium.
Here's a study that appeared in the world's top science journal, and yet years went by and they never noticed that the data description that accompanied the paper was wrong, that there were very important methodological issues that weren't described in the paper.
McIntyre and McKendrick noted that the graph using the corrected data could still be wrong because the methodology used in the MBH 98 was fundamentally incorrect. They wrote in geophysical research letters that, quote, the effect of the transformation is so strong that a hockey stick-shaped PC1 curve is almost always generated from a trendless red noise with the persistent properties of the North American tree ring network, unquote. In other words, when McIntyre and McKendrick analyzed random data using MBH 98 methodology, out popped a hockey stick every time. The McIntyre-McKendrick report generated so much controversy that the U.S. Congress authorized the National Academy of Sciences to study and report on the issue. The National Academy essentially supported the McIntyre-McKendrick report by warning that the methodology used in MBH 98 should not be used for this type of research because it, quote, tends to bias the shape of the reconstructions, unquote. Although the report also criticized other aspects of the MBH 98, it did so in a very apologetic manner, leading the media to proclaim that the National Academy actually supported MBH 98. Separate from the National Academy, the Energy and Commerce Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives commissioned 3 prominent statisticians, chaired by an eminent statistics professor, Edward Wegman, chairman of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences Committee on Theoretical and Applied Statistics, to review both the MBH 98 and the McIntyre-McKendrick critique. The Wegman report found that, quote, while the work of Mann and colleagues presents what appears to be compelling evidence of global temperature change, the criticisms of McIntyre and McKendrick, as well as those of other authors mentioned, are indeed valid. We found that the MBH-98 to be somewhat obscure and incomplete, and the criticisms of McIntyre-McKendrick to be valid and compelling." Unquote. In spite of this, Al Gore prominently displays the hockey stick in Inconvenient Truth, as does the 2004 Arctic Climate Impact Assessment, making both highly suspect. Dr. Vincent Gray, a chemist and IPCC expert reviewer, shares his concerns about why the discredited hockey stick continues to be used.
They made up what they were going to do beforehand and then chose whatever science they could find which they thought might support it. That's my view. They had another scare a few years ago because one of the people from the IPCC went on an Arctic cruise, you see, and he was absolutely amazed to find there was open sea. And he put an article in the New York Times saying, you know, this proves global warming. He had failed to notice that the Northwest Passage was first negotiated by a man called Roald Amundsen in 1906.
Recent research shows that 8,000 years ago, temperatures were 6 to 8 degrees higher in the Arctic than today, and that dramatic changes occurred in only a few decades. Nevertheless, polar bears and other Arctic wildlife obviously adapted and survived, and so are also not threatened today.
About 5,000 years ago, the world was much warmer than it is today, and warmer even than they're forecasting for the most extreme global warming forecasts.
A common misconception amongst the general public is that temperatures are rapidly increasing. This is only with some of the surface data, and it's selected surface data. In fact, if much of the surface data that's collected is from around urban areas or areas which have had significant land use change, and this data is contaminated. On the other hand, satellites provide comprehensive coverage of the Earth 24/7 for the last 20 years. And so what they have demonstrated is that there has been an almost imperceptible rise in temperature over this time.
But is there really much difference between temperatures in cities and that of the rest of the world?
I did studies in Winnipeg 25 years ago. We were measuring the heat island of the city of Winnipeg, and we found as much as 10 degrees Celsius difference between Portage and Maine, which is supposedly the coldest part of Winnipeg, and the airport 8 kilometers away.
Most cities of the world have hotter temperatures than the surrounding countryside. That has nothing to do with carbon dioxide and everything to do with land use. Modern cities have concrete buildings with asphalt roofs that generate heat, which creates artificial heat that elevates the temperature that doesn't really reflect the true climate.
We have balloons that go up through the atmosphere twice each day from locations around the world, and they're in near perfect agreement with the satellite record.
What about the relatively warm year 1998? Was that global warming or a naturally occurring event, such as El Nino?
In 1997-98, we had a major El Nino develop at low latitude, and there was a tremendous amount of water vapor pumped up in the atmosphere, and we had a 1 degree Celsius spike around the world that was noted at that time that disappeared within a few months.
It's not even 25 years ago that the great threat was global cooling. You go back to the 70s and 76, and people like Ponte publishing books called The Cooling, and the scientific consensus then was that we were headed for cooling.
A quote from Newsweek magazine. Now listen to this. This is the quote. It says, "There are ominous signs that the Earth's weather patterns have begun to change dramatically, and that these changes may portend a drastic decline in food production with serious political implications for just about every nation on Earth." Second, a headline in the New York Times reads, "Climate changes endanger world's food output." Here's another quote from Time magazine. "As they review the bizarre and unpredictable weather pattern of the past several years, a growing number of scientists are beginning to suspect that many seemingly contradictory meteorological fluctuations are actually part of a global climate upheaval." All this sounds very ominous. That is until you realize that the 3 quotes I just read were from articles in 1975, editions of Newsweek magazine and the New York Times, and of Time magazine in 1974. They weren't referring to global warming. They were warning of a coming ice age. So the same people who were hysterical back then are using the same words to describe what's happening today. Let me repeat. All 3 of those quotes were published in the 1970s, warning of a coming ice age. The other ice age is coming. We're all going to die.